if this is what Christians are like and this is what they'll do to hold on to power, I don't know that I want to be part of this.
Yeah.
How do we solve that in the next 5 minutes? Welcome back to Jesus versus America. Jesus told us that we could not follow two masters. And every week we come back to see that many of us are struggling with trying to follow Jesus in an American culture, and especially in a Christian culture that tells us that we really should be following the American way. I'm John, and I'm joined by Monique and Wisdom. We represent 3 generations of Christians who are trying to faithfully follow Jesus. Today's topic is, how did Christianity become so associated with the Republican Party? If you're listening to this, you might just assume that every Christian is part of the Republican Party, that it is taught, it is dictated, and in some places in the country, that's actually true. And this is not just true at a low level, like church local level. It's even taught in some seminaries. There are prominent Christians who might say that it is a sin to vote for any candidate that's not part of the Republican Party. But you should know that there are other Christians who are not part of the Republican Party. And outside of evangelicalism, which we're going to focus our conversation on, and even within evangelicals, there are many Christians who find that this alliance with the Republican Party first isn't mandated for certain, but to some, it's actually kind of a hated alliance. And we're going to be exploring that today about how they became so associated together. Before I do that, though, I want to kind of lay the groundwork of why it's important. This question comes up all the time, and it's being asked all over the country, especially since the election of Donald Trump. But as being somebody in an older generation, it's been asked repeatedly, even back to the George W. Bush administration, all the way back to even the Ronald Reagan administration. How did this come about? Because it wasn't always the case. So the first thing you should know is that this is probably a 45-year phenomenon, and it wasn't always the case, and it wasn't a question that was asked every time we go somewhere to speak. Why is this important? Wisdom, I'm going to start with you, because what I'm looking for is kind of a view of the people on the ground. Do they care about this issue, and does it impact the way they see the Christian faith, whether they're following Jesus or trying to, or whether they're outside the faith? How does Gen Z look at this issue?
Christians and Republicans, like the terms are so married to each other in culture. It's almost shocking when I meet somebody and I try to pull them apart. They're like, really? How? And they might not even have grown up Christian, but it's so married to one another, the terms, that when I explain myself to somebody and be like, yeah, I work at a church, I'm a Christian, I have to follow it up with, I didn't, blah, 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 I don't vote for blah, 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 I don't exclude, I don't hate, blah, 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 blah. And it's like all these, like, what is it, like conditions you have to give when you're saying that you're a Christian in 2023. Yeah, the terms are so married together. And it's like, if you are a Republican, you will assume that they are a Christian. If you're a Christian, you will assume that they're a Republican. And they hate this group of people, they vote this way. They're this kind of person. It even goes down to personality too. Like, you're probably stubborn, like there's so many things added to it. That's really hard, being a Christian. That's really, really hard, being attached to ideology that's not even fully the Bible, and having that label on you. And that's like my personal experience. Like I have to give those conditions of things that I'm not before I say what I am. And I think it draws people away from the church because the two are so married together. And I think that's partly because of the widespread quickness and of social media, and, evangelicals taking on a political ideology and saying this is the Christian way. And it's just so out there all the time that it begins to be true. If you put any person and get their social circle around them to say that grass is blue, eventually they're going to start to believe grass is blue. And it's kind of been the thing for evangelicals being Republican. They equal one another. And so that's just the culture's like view of it, because it's been so widely put out there. It's been a political agenda and campaign on, literal political figure side. Like, I'm a Christian and I'm this. And then again, it's just so widespread out there that it just becomes true to people, whether they're a Christian or not, grew up in the church or not. And And it's hard. It's just really hard to be a Christian today because you have to separate the two terms that are just so married to each other.
Is it fair to say that there's some people who won't give Christianity a fair hearing? Have you experienced that? I mean, of course, there's somebody out there that's true of, but do you think that's kind of widespread that there's some people who think, I can't really seriously consider the Christian faith, or I'm not sure I could stay in it because of this connection?
Yes. And it's not just of the connection, it's also because of an experience they had too. So it's not just, it's one thing to see it in media, it's another thing to experience it also, which is really strange. Like they'll say like, yeah, I can't hear you out on what you believe because I've been hurt by the church in this way, and I see the church vote this way, and those are the same agendas that have hurt me or have hurt my friend or have hurt my family member. It's like you become less receptive to it because of not just the advertising of it, but also the experience that people have.
Well, it's just like it's the language of Christianity now. Like the conversation, the language that's happening, this discourse that's coming out of Christianity is political now. Yeah. And just when you see posting, like for an example, I had a former friend, a really good friend that used to always post like Facebook. Is anyone even on Facebook anymore? But Facebook, and it was always like a Bible verse, a positive thing, a whatever. And then over time, it was just like political, hate, vitriol. And it's like, what happened to this person that I could look at your page and be like, oh, they're so loving and they just love God, and be like, no, now you're just all about like these very specific agendas that feel angry and hateful. And I literally just had a conversation with my best friend yesterday, and she sent me a screenshot from a post of someone in her family, and she's like, can you believe this? And I read it, and it was very, I'm not going to repeat what it said, but it was very hateful. It was, in my opinion, something that God would not put out there or say. And in the language of this statement was, and like, glory to God and God. So it was like married into the statement. And she literally was like, this is why. Yeah. I'm so done. I'm so tired. Like, I'm so tired of the church. Why is the church like this, right? Because the people are the church too, but then it goes straight there. And what I appreciate about her is she allows me to push back. And I'm like, well, you have to remember, I'm one of the church and you would never say that about me. Yeah. So we have to remember that like, this isn't like really how it is across the board or how it needs to be or whatever, but I'm having to make excuses and remind, but...
It's the plaster, too, of, like, the images and symbols also, like, a cross will mean so many things. You put it on something and you assume also. And they put the cross next to the American flag, and, like, they put Jesus, with a bald eagle flying behind
Lady
him.
Liberty.
Next to Lady Liberty. It's like Jesus and Lady Liberty being best friends. And then the term that comes up, God bless America. And the images just constantly being plastered, or the glory be to God tag at the end of your Facebook posts or whatever. It just...
Which on its own, it's like, yeah, I want God to bless America. But that's the thing. It's like even the innocuous things, you're like, but that's a good thing. We want God to bless our leaders. Like we want that, but it's what it has come to mean. Yeah. It's been reclaimed in a negative, vitriolic way that now people... Even the flag itself, like across the board, Republican or Democrats, 4th of July or whatever it is, or wearing the flag was just like, oh, it's our country. Now your flag is flying and it means something.
Yes, that's so true. 4th of July is not the same.
No, people start to not want to celebrate. And then it makes it worse. They're like, you see, they hate our country. It's so intertwined. It's very messy.
It is. I think that it's almost become like one party is claiming ownership of the flag, or if you fly the flag. I was pointing out to my wife the other day, we were driving down the road and there was one of those big trucks, those big trucks, they put the flag on. This one had 2 of them and they were the largest flags I'd ever seen. They looked like they took them down off a tall building, and there were 2 of them. And I thought, is one not enough anymore? You can't.
They want to make sure you know where they stand.
And I think there is a sense where you just feel like triggered by seeing that image.
Yeah, it
Tell
is
me
triggering.
about your friend and her faith. Was she part of, does she have faith? Is she thinking about leaving the faith?
Did vary. All of the things, Christian university, missions, working in a church, got burned by a church doing so. Just, yeah, all of the things. And I wouldn't say she doesn't have faith anymore, but she's not stepping into a church anytime soon and won't, and has had to rethink what faith means to her. And it's something that I find a privilege to walk alongside her because we can have these conversations, and she's an incredible person. And it's heartbreaking because I can see the points of hurt. And it's worse when it's your family too, that like it hurts more because now it's associated with pain from family, from the people closest to you, the church you attended. It's all around you. It's all you see. And you start to think all Christians are this way. This is what Christianity is. This is who Jesus is. And I'm like, no, let me take you by the hand and show you that no.
My friend, when he first joined a church, into his 30s, I think he was, when he became a Christian, he looked around and saw everybody wearing khakis. So he wore khakis, even though he was in a punk rock band. So he just thought that's what Christians do. And I think the way that people believe that Christians become Republicans the same way, like you just walk around and everybody's saying the same thing, parroting the same thing, and you get that message. Yeah. I have that uncle. Everybody has that uncle, cable news uncle. He's that uncle, right? And Thanksgiving is so painful depending on it's usually close to an election of some kind. I just dread this holiday. Everybody does, I think, these days. Thanksgiving has become its own unique type of hell because of all the political division. And he's a faithful follower of Jesus, but he's also more faithful follower of cable news and right-wing cable news. And when we have these conversations and I tell him, look, I work with young adults for 20 years now, and I'm telling you that probably the biggest issue repelling young adults from the church is this alliance politically and what the church has had to compromise, at least evangelicals. And I won't say the whole church again, because we can't talk with such broad strokes. You talk about Black Protestants, you talk about Catholics, there's other faiths, you even talk about the mainline Protestants. They're much more diverse on this issue, but there's so much less diversity among evangelicals. And I'll tell him, because he thinks that's the only church anyway, so all those others aren't really Christian in his mind, which I vehemently disagree with. But he says that everyone is looking for an excuse not to believe in Jesus. That's his view. And this is just the latest excuse. And my response to him is, but you're the one giving them that excuse. Your behavior, your hypocrisy, your marriage to a political ideology, your desire to hold on to power, and I would underline at all costs.
Yes.
Despite all attitudes, despite all teachings of Jesus to the contrary at times. Yeah. That is what they see, and you're giving them that. I was looking at Matthew 18:6-7, where Jesus brings the children to him, but then he kind of switches it. And he starts talking about all believers, especially younger believers. So it isn't just about children. It's when Matthew uses the term little ones, which I'm going to cite, he's talking about all those who believe in him and are new in the faith. And this is what Jesus teaches in Matthew 18. He says, if anyone causes any of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of these things that cause people to stumble. Such things must come, but woe to the person through whom they come. And then he goes on to says, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. Like, take seriously how much we need to avoid this kind of thing. And I just wonder that is causing people to stumble, and we never talk about it. I mean, if I were the pastor of a large megachurch and I had a scandal involving abuse or financial impropriety or had an affair or something, and that caused people to stumble, all the things would come out, decrying how I caused all those thousands and thousands of people to stumble and lose their faith. But we have millions and millions of young adults walking out over this alliance, and no one seems to call to task the public witness of so many evangelicals when they say things that contradict things they just, most of the time you could just pick it up and say, like, you said this 3 years ago, and now you're saying this. Both were said to the media. I didn't say them. You said them. This is documented hypocrisy, and the only thing that changed was that if you stuck with your earlier belief, you wouldn't be voting for the person you're voting for, right? I think young people can see that. They can smell it miles away. But the impact it does, if they were to leave their faith or just think, you know what, I'll never consider that faith, The very words of life I will never consider because of the witness of all those who claim they've experienced it.
Yeah.
That breaks my heart more than
Yeah.
anything.
Well, it's like people are leaving the church at the hands of Christians. And I'm glad that you brought up that verse. Full disclosure, I cringed at first when you were going to bring up that verse. I was like, well, where are you going to go with this, John? Because I just want to mention, because anyone that just heard that right now, if you've ever been involved with the church or been attacked with a verse, it's probably that one. And people always use it like, see, the people of the world that don't agree with my viewpoints, when you publicly stand and try to accept or show love to this, you're causing the little one to stumble, instead of reading the verse and pointing it back at themselves and being like, the way that you're dying on that hill and the way that you are attacking and going after and going to war with humans that the Lord loves, you are causing them to walk away. Like, this verse applies to you 20-fold.
Yeah.
First and foremost, this applies to you. So
Right.
if what you're putting out there is causing people to walk away, because I've heard people be like, well, if they walk away because truth is truth and it's going to divide people, and truth is love and tough love, and love is hard. And no, like, those are all excuses. You are causing people to walk away.
Hypocrites and legalists always read the scripture pointing to somebody else
Of
instead of
course.
realizing that it's a call to repentance
Yeah.
in their own life, right?
Yeah.
You're reclaiming this
Right?
passage.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it the Pharisee that said, like, oh, thank you, Lord, for that I'm not like that person,
Yeah.
right? And Jesus said it was that person
Yeah.
who showed up and said, Lord, forgive me because I'm a sinner, that was walked away justified. And you could always spot somebody who's just not even aware of their own hypocrisy or their legalism because of the way that they, we used to say they use the Bible like a bludgeoning thing, an
Yeah.
instrument to beat people over the head. But what they're really doing is every verse they read is a justification for their position against someone, right?
Right.
And we need to be
Or
careful
to feel
of
like,
that.
see, I'm good.
Right.
It's you
to justify
that's-
ourselves.
I
Yeah.
want to ask, like, when did that person, though, and why does that person have the microphone? Like, why are they the representative, and where are the Christians that are real Christians, and what do we do to take that microphone back? Like, you cannot.
This.
Like,
But that's the thing.
tune in.
So
It makes me angry. Like, why do you have the platform? Actually, is it the job for the Christian to be aggressive back, or do we be meek in this? But
I think to turn into the very thing that we decry in others means that we ultimately lose in the end. That's Jesus's way, is not to do those things, right? Even
That's
when
so
they
frustrating.
might be effective, but I don't even know that they would be effective. Let's be real. Right now, hatred sells, just like Monique was saying.
Yeah.
Hatred sells, anger sells, like clarity sells. Like, you don't need any nuance. And the Christian faith is so nuanced. There's so
Nuanced.
much tension.
Yes.
Jesus' way presented like lots of things that you had to examine yourself over, but it's easier to just be definitive and certain. And studies even show that if you preach definitively and certainly, where there's no nuance, it's all black and white, and you hate certain things and you love other things, your church actually grows, because most people are lemmings and they don't want to think. They don't want to nuance. They just want to show up to somebody who tells them you're right and they're wrong.
Unless you're my people.
And
The
God
Jews have
loves
been
you.
sitting down on a Friday and talking about things for
That's why
thousands
their
of years.
Their movement didn't explode, right? Because like people are like, that's too hard to do. Like
you don't think it would work,
requires.
though? Like,
Of course, I think it would be effective for producing great things in us in the way that Jesus wanted to transform us.
Yeah.
But I think what it doesn't do is grow popular movements. And I think even Jesus saw that. Every time he said the difficult things, people fled.
Yeah.
Right? He had to turn to his own disciples
So
and
we
say,
just need to be ready for that.
are you going to leave me too? Right? When he
Yeah.
actually said it in a way that people understood clearly what he was asking them to.
it just makes me so angry. Like, it just makes me so angry that Jesus is so misrepresented, and it's on such a wide platform, and so many people are watching, and it just feels like the church, the real one, I want to say, this might be wrong, but it just feels like we just watch it happen, and that's so frustrating.
I think we're doing this for that reason is the only hopeful thing I'd say. And maybe I'd say if you're listening to this and you know somebody needs to hear this too, maybe that's the only place that they're going to hear it. That's why we're doing this. We don't We're trying to counter that in a thoughtful way, but I'll just say that from years of doing this, a small group of people want to be thoughtful and want to actually follow Jesus in the way that he laid himself out, as opposed to the way that just makes sense to the American consumer. The way you can package it, brand it, make it easy, make it certain, make it almost patriotic. And I don't just mean in the country sort of way. I'm just saying that you just feel that good sense that you're right and everything's good. And that is hard because Jesus refused to be categorized in so many of his teachings in a way that's easy to do. But I marvel at how many people, that's how they see Jesus. Yeah. Can I go back to the beginning of this movement for a moment? I know this might be a little bit historical, but one of the things I hear from people all the time is that the reason that Christians and the Republican Party are so aligned is over the issue of abortion. And I actually think that's true. There is overlap in that area. It's one of the key areas. One of my good friends from law school, who's a very thoughtful person and a very deeply devoted follower of Jesus, and is gentle. Like, we always have very interesting conversations, and he will vote for every Republican president in any election, no matter who they are. And his reason is, it's just one issue for me. It's the issue of abortion. I think it's an evil. I think it's murder. And I want to see it end in any way possible. And that includes voting for every Republican so that they might do what just happened, which is to appoint people to the court that overturn Roe versus Wade. We're not going to get into the whole thing. I'm just going to say, I know for some people that is a big deal, and we'd have to deal with that in its own episode. We probably will. What I want to say is there is overlap in that area. A great number of Christians, and I started seeing this when I was first just even becoming aware of political movements in the 80s, that there is this overlap, and they really do make good bedfellows in this area where Christians want to see abortion either severely restricted or outlawed entirely. And I think Republicans maybe originally didn't know about that, but then suddenly took this on, and it became a really good way to capture a huge voting bloc. But the question I get is, isn't that the reason they're aligned? And I want to go back in time and say, not originally. And most people don't know this. I mean, there's been a lot of research on this, a lot of writing on this, but most of us are not reading this history. And the history actually starts with a very interesting minister who became very prominent later on. His name was Jerry Falwell Sr., and he was actually one of the architects of the religious right. He was the architect of the moral majority that helped a Republican candidate named Ronald Reagan become president by helping him understand this evangelical bloc and getting it. But before he ever got into politics, his famous statement, I've always loved this, talk about the hypocrites and the legalists. Jerry Falwell said, preachers are not called to be politicians, but to be soul winners. They're not to get involved in politics. He was heavily critical of preachers that wanted to get into political movements.
Does his son know that, though?
Yeah. Well, of course, the person he was being critical of was the preacher known as Martin Luther King, who was leading the civil rights movement. So if you're leading the civil rights movement, if you as a preacher, as a believer, as a follower in Jesus, as somebody who studied in seminary, had a doctorate, if you decide that there should be no more segregation and equality for African Americans and for all races, and you begin to lead this nonviolent movement in favor of doing that actually results in real meaningful change, you should just be at home winning souls and not involved in politics. Of course, Jerry Falwell himself was setting up segregation academies. That's probably why he didn't want Martin Luther King doing anything political, because what Jerry Falwell was doing with the good time that God gave him was setting up segregated schools that were private so that they couldn't be desegregated by the government. They could just be white-only institutions.
Let's take a moment to let that just sink in for a second, because we're just breezing past a lot of stuff here.
I'm over here like...
And it's heavy, and again, not all Christians, but we need to sit with this. This is part of our history. So the church had a moment, part of the church, Falwell, whatever part he represented, did not want our country to be integrated, wanted to keep us separate, was building Christian universities that he wanted to be for whites only.
And regular schools as well.
Schools as well. So just just give that a moment to sink in, because I just want people to, if they're hearing this for the first time, and whatever your stance is on abortion or politics and Christianity, just know the history of like maybe where that came from or like why that became important to you, and just start to untangle that and just think about it. Just know where the roots are. Not that it should necessarily change your opinion. Know where the roots are, because this is a reality, and we need to know, we need to be educated, we need people to know, we need to think about it and go.
And in this context that these segregation academies are being set up, it's so odious that even a Republican president, Richard Nixon, says this, we can't allow this, right? So he says to his own Internal Revenue Service, like, I want you to start looking into these schools and seeing if they should remain tax exempt. And the bottom line is that's the issue that begins to mobilize conservative evangelicals to think about entering politics. So Roe versus Wade is decided in 1973. Most evangelicals don't react. In fact, the head of one of the largest the Southern Baptist Convention was kind of quoted as saying, I always thought that life began after birth anyway. So the fact that they're restricting abortion to only the first trimester didn't seem to faze anyone. And in fairness, it's hard to measure how many abortions there were really going on at the time. But you fast forward to the end of the 70s, and maybe abortion was on the rise. It clearly probably was because it was legalized. But they're trying to defeat a Democratic president, and they find this candidate, Ronald Reagan, and they begin to coalesce around him, and they begin to bring these issues in. But the main animating issue at the time was this idea that the IRS was going to desegregate Bob Jones University,
right?
Which you know something about, was a segregated university that did not admit, at least initially, any Black students.
Correct. Yeah, I don't want to gloss over the fact, because again, we're just kind of barreling through this because it's so much information. It's so interesting. But people are like, wait, you were just talking about segregation. Now we're talking about abortion. So if you're confused, I just feel like the bottom line here is people wanted to hold on to power to keep their segregated universities. And it was hard for the country. Even Nixon, let that sink in. Even Nixon was not for this, okay? So the people that don't like the Republicans definitely don't like Nixon. Even Nixon was like, this is a step too far. We're not going to give you tax exemption if you're going to be segregated. So the people who wanted to hold on to power and to be able to continue to have their segregated schools said, the country's not really rallying around us the way they thought that they would to hold on to segregation. So let's hitch ourselves to a topic that maybe we can get people to rally around. This is where abortion enters. We'll make that the issue, but we'll get our people in office, and then maybe they'll, through back avenues, help us out and let us continue.
That's a good distinction, because I think abortion appealed more to people in the North, especially the Midwest and the North. People in the South, largely Democrats, by the way, like the whole Bible Belt at the time of Reagan was still heavily Democratic, even though they were conservative Democrats. But because of the Civil War, they refused to join the Republican Party, which is an interesting fact, right? The North was the party of Lincoln.
Gen Zers listening to this right now, like, what?
We had a president named Lincoln, and there was a Civil War, and he was a Republican. And because of that, most of the South was strongly Democratic, even though they were very conservative socially. And Reagan's genius was recognizing that and appealing to them. He won 2 elections based on that before they actually converted into the Republican Party. But what that means is, to get those Bible Belt voters to switch from Democratic allegiance to Republican allegiance, you needed some motivating factors, right? Segregation was definitely motivating in the South, which was still fighting civil rights movement. But in the North, that wasn't such a big issue. I mean, it wasn't that racism didn't exist and segregation didn't exist. Yeah. It exists everywhere in this country, but it was less of an animating issue. So abortion was moved in, and they actually tried a number of issues. They tried abortion, they tried several things, but that one seemed to gain the most traction. And it is ironic because Ronald Reagan, when he was governor of California, had authored probably the most liberal abortion law in the country, and he had signed it. And if you look today,
Reagan, surely.
If you look today at Reagan, like I was alive during Reagan. I thought he was amazing, bringing the country out of the 1970s and the terrible times we'd been through. So I've been a fan of Reagan historically. I will say one thing: he couldn't even be elected dog catcher in today's Republican Party, right? I mean, he was the governor of California. That's a strike, right? He was for amnesty
Yeah.
for immigrants in this country who
Love
had crossed the right.
A Republican governor of California.
Yeah.
Right.
I
And,
remember,
and he was for amnesty. They even had debates where before he was elected, he was talking about this. When he was in office, he signed the largest amnesty I think we've ever had. He was the head of a labor union when he was part of the Screen Actors Guild. He was part of entertainment, right? He was an actor. I mean, you just go down the list and you think, there is no way this guy could even get close to the primaries now.
Yeah.
Everything has moved so far
But
from
he's
where
so
he
idolized
was.
too, which is just so interesting.
He's kind of the
it goes-
patron saint, right? And
Yeah.
then now you think like, on what basis? Like, what would it be other
It
than?
goes to show that, like, for Gen Zers, for like younger ones watching, like, you don't, like, Republicans looked different.
Yeah.
And it didn't always look like this. It looked like this in your lifetime, but not too far long ago, it looked like that.
I was a political science minor, and one of my professors, I'll never forget, said the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are the same party. If you look at all the parties around the world, they're almost exactly the same party. They're called the Capitalist Party. That's what he thought they were, right? That was true in the 1980s when I was studying that. That is no longer true.
Yeah.
I mean, they are so far apart, and they
Yeah.
both moved to the extreme. Let's be fair.
Yeah.
They both moved to the extreme. But what happened was Jerry Falwell and a guy named Paul Weyrich and a couple other people got together and backed Reagan and basically exposed him to the idea that there is this large voting bloc that will come along if you say the right things and you align on certain issues, some of which you probably already are aligned on, and others if you just say you're aligned on. And those became issues like the war on drugs and the war against pornography and all those kinds of things. Like if you just go down this socially conservative path, you're going to capture this large group of people who are largely not politically motivated right now. And that began what was called the moral majority. And that began in the 1980s. And I think from then until now, it just, that marriage just gets stronger and stronger and stronger every year.
Who was Jerry
gross.
to say that to Reagan? Was he like a political?
He was not. I mean, look, like I said,
commentator
he
or-
wasn't politically involved, but he
Like,
was the.
who gave him the authority to say that and put him in the room?
He was the head of a very large church. So he was, it was a very large church and he was pretty active. And by the way, these other people like Paul Weyrich was already involved. He was a Washington, D.C. conservative activist. It was a number of people that came together. But a lot of these groups that we later heard of, like Focus on the Family and the Family Research Council, those were all being formed around this time. And people clumped them together in a group called the Religious Right. But it was really this organization called the Moral Majority that said, look, we could deliver these votes if you put our issues into your platform. Because people will listen to this. And largely it spreads church to church.
And those
you know?
issues weren't necessarily considered political back then.
I think some of them were going to be new. Like I said, I mean, abortion had only been legalized by the Supreme Court ruling maybe 6-7 years earlier, right? So, you know, to come up with these things was, you know, politically it was ingenious.
Yeah.
Well, and with a name like that, the moral
Right.
majority.
That's right.
Alliteration.
Yeah.
Fun.
I mean, how does that not make good bedfellows with churches and you know,
Yeah.
how does it not?
If you saw the election night results for Ronald Reagan, especially his second term, I mean, it was, when we say landslide, like you've never seen a map that is so red in your life. I don't know if his opponent won 3 states. I mean, I'm speculating now. It was almost nothing.
Who was that? Dukakis?
Yeah, it was so.
I wasn't around for this.
It was so overwhelming, and that's when everybody realized, like, we've got this formula. It's going to work. Like, it's going to continue. Let me be fair. There are issues that the Republican Party stands for that are truly good issues that Christians should support, right? And when we get to our discussion, for example, on abortion, we might even say that might be one of them, and it's a fair place that they meet together. There might be others, right? And there may be just others where back then we thought that it would be a good idea to back this or back that or have a war on drugs or something. Maybe back then they thought it was at least compatible. What I want to think about is what's happening now. Like fast forward, that marriage began then.
Well, and the way that political power absolutely corrupts, it just does. And when it's entangled with the church, I'm going to go on record and say it's going to corrupt the church to a certain degree or in a specific way.
How do you see that now? How is it corrupting the church now?
In the ways I think we've already talked about, we care less about what Jesus actually taught and stood for, and we care more about holding on to power forcing the nation to go in a certain direction, meeting our agendas, making sure this nation is a Christian nation through and through, not respecting the freedoms of other types of belief and thought, and just taking that and holding on to power. I really don't think on the political level that it is about, Jesus' love for people. It's like, we got to hold on to power. We got to control the policies. We've got to control the narrative. We've got to force our agenda on this country, make it as homogenous as we possibly can, if we can, so that we can continue to be successful and rich and powerful and a force to be reckoned with around the world. Because God forbid America, the number one nation, they would say, would slip behind, even though
I'm gonna play a different side. Let's say that's a good thing for a right-wing politician or political party to believe in. So I'm not taking it out
Christian America,
not even a Christian
part?
America. Like just I look at political movements all over the world, and the right-wing parties always come up, and they're anti-immigrant, and they're what makes like what makes Germany Germany, or what makes Italy Italy. I mean, we could go across the world, right? You could even go to Asia. Like, what makes this country this way, right? It's because our people are this, right? So let's say you're going to do that as a right-wing kind of politician, as a more authoritarian type of politician.
Which leans towards fascism.
But the question really comes back to, and then why do Christians find anything about their faith compatible with those kinds of views? And I really do think it's an effort to hold on to that power that they experience and not give it up in any
and
way.
Maybe it's a little bit entangled with prosperity gospel too. Like, we're just doing so well, and we want to continue to do well. We want God to continue to bless us. And when a certain group of people have, whether they know it or not, have had the advantage and the power for so many years, they look back on it and be like, remember the golden era of America where we could all do this? I'm like, it was the golden era for you, because at that time there was slavery and there was this and segregation, and they don't see that. They're like, it was the golden era for us. And we haven't known it any other way. We're starting to see that slip away, and it's very uncomfortable. So that must mean that it's morally defunct, and like we're getting off the rails. So let's do whatever we can to keep it in the golden era when we were all doing great. It's like, we weren't all doing great. It's such an imagined thing. You were doing great. One group of people was doing great.
Yeah, that naked effort to just hold on to power causes you to do weird things. You go back and think about when Bill Clinton in office had an affair with an intern, right?
Yeah.
And all the things that church leaders said about the fitness for office of the American president based on what happened. So again, this is recorded. They went out to the media. They said all these statements in an effort to get him impeached and all of these things, right? And shame on him for what he did.
But Trump is sorry.
Yeah, but you move forward, right, to somebody who's also caught on tape saying that they're going to grab people by the genitals, people who are paying off porn stars, right?
Affairs.
And the same leaders now are asked, didn't you say that Bill Clinton was no longer fit to lead this country because of his actions? Didn't you say those things? What do you say now? And
it becomes a lesser of two evils then. Yeah. Then all of a sudden it's convenient. Well, but at least whether he's whatever he is, he's going to do what we think is.
And in case anyone's
Bill
missing
Clinton
it, my contention is that especially Gen Z, but I worked with millennials for so long, they see that.
Yeah.
And unless they've been subsumed into the same power structure themselves, most of them are like, I'm out. Like when they're confronted with that level, I mean, I'm not just talking about like a hypocrisy. We're all hypocrites. This is like public statements, to the media, and you're a power broker for your people, right?
Yeah.
That's how you're presenting yourselves. Yeah. You're speaking on behalf of Christians across America, and you can't even stay consistent on this. I think people just say that's where it goes. I saw these stats. So in 2011, 30% of white evangelicals believe that an elected official can behave ethically if they've committed transgressions in their personal life. So this is a good period of time after Bill Clinton, at least a decade, a little bit more. 30% of white evangelicals believe that in 2011. In 2020, 72% of evangelicals white evangelicals believed that you could still act ethically even though you've had all these
They
transgressions.
had to believe it.
To have a 42% shift in a decade, less than a decade, 9 years.
Because it's not about the morals.
Right.
It's not about the Christianity. It's not about the morals. It's about the power and the agenda.
Yeah. And that's where this alignment comes from. Because 70% of Republicans, by the way, said the same thing in 2020. They said it's 70%, it's fine if you've ethically transgressed. You can still be an ethical person. And evangelicals are just slightly ahead of that at 72%. It does make a good match for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
But I think both are looking at, well, our political leader may be flawed, but at this point, it doesn't matter because we need to win. I think that's part of the issue where we need to be more honest.
Yeah, well, you said like we need to win. I think it's also beyond power. It's just like winning too. Like I feel like they're different because I don't know, for the evangelical church, for some reason, they want to be on the winning team in this game that they are
No, it's almost
a player
like
in.
it proves God is real if
them.
there's certain people that feel like maybe it proves God is real if we keep winning in these ways. See, we passed that. People agree with us. God is real. See, it's like we don't need that to justify that like God is real or
there's like a feeling of like we're oppressed as Christians
Yes.
and we win here and like it's our turn. Like so I want to shift it from the power thing. I want to bring it to the winning thing. Like there's a hunger for like
Validation.
winning and like being the
Yeah.
number one in this because we haven't been.
That's right. That when you ask a lot of people who support Republican candidates, and especially Trump, but many Republican candidates are becoming just, they see that Trumpism is spreading through the Republican Party. It's just going to be the mold of the party even after he's gone. When you ask people like, how are the behavior of these candidates or how are their attitudes consistent with your Christian faith? Really what it comes down to, a lot of sociologists find, is that they like the fact that this person's a fighter, that they'll say anything, they'll do anything to win. You're onto something about the winning. That's really what becomes important is you say, but they're saying things that are first, not even in the scripture. They're actually contradicting the scripture. Their attitude is nothing like Jesus.
Yeah.
Like, tell us what you like about them. And a lot of them will distill it down. It might be a broad generalization, but they'll distill it down to they're willing to do and say anything to win. And we need to win. It's more important that we win because if we lose, it's calamitous to this country.
Or a feeling that we've been losing, which is, I don't know where it came from.
Like I remember when the Supreme Court made the gay marriage decision in Obergefell, like you'd think it was a national day of mourning across the nation. And I'm not going to take a position on this right now. I'm just going to say that it felt like something had been taken away that was so precious to them. Like the nation was over for most of those people. Now, fast forward like 8 years later and we're still here and all sorts of other decisions have come out. So I would say it is fair to think that the status quo has been eroding and they are losing some things where it was this very specific vision of America and a certain vision of a Christian America that you could have in the 1950s and the 1960s when there was so little diversity in the country and it just felt a certain way. I think that's there. One of the hardest sermons I ever had to preach was the one before the election in 2016. Because I was trying to talk to the congregation about what would God do to allow us to steward a vote. Like, how would we steward a vote? Like, Jesus was talking at a time when people didn't vote for Caesar. There was no voting. There was just military rule. Here we are in a country where we get this incredible privilege and we have a vote. How do you steward it? But I remember I came across this research that, I was preaching the Sunday before the Tuesday we were going to vote. And it was asking white evangelicals, what is the most important issue in this election? It was back then, it was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. What is the most important issue in this election to evangelicals? And 26% said the economy. 22% said national security. 15% said character, personal character. 10% said the Supreme Court. So some people are like, I'm only for the Supreme Court. That's only 10%. 7% said religious freedom, which is always what people are citing, religious freedom. 5% said their position on immigration. Only 4% said their position on abortion.
Wow.
And it's so interesting that even when we say like this is the galvanizing issue that brings Christians and Republicans together, when you ask people, what is the most important issue in this election? I mean, here you've got somebody who's demonstrated their unfitness for office repeatedly during the campaign trail. Maybe both of them, by the way. Let's say both of them have demonstrated their unfitness for office. What's the most important issue to you? Economy, national security. Like, where's abortion on the list? 4%. And it just, again, shows just when we're talking about these issues, I think people can see this a mile away and say, I don't want to be part of this anymore. And the part they don't want to be part of, because they're going to have to make a political decision between one party and another, but they don't have to make a decision about Jesus. They can just skip that part and just say, I don't know, this just seems like if this is what Christians are like and this is what they'll do to hold on to power, I don't know that I want to be part of this.
Yeah.
How do we solve that in the next 5 minutes?
Man.
Yeah, I know. I can tell. It's kind of like,
how you can't. I don't know. How do you solve it? How do you solve it, John?
I'm going to say that this is the one issue that if I were to ever want to join a monastery or
the monastic life for us.
Live the monastic
That's all there's
life
left.
of quietly gardening and speaking with a few people who came to seek wisdom.
Yeah.
This might be the animating issue for me.
Yeah.
That would cause me to do that, because I'll tell you that I've watched it, I've studied it, I've talked about it, I've written about it, I've taught public policy, I've done all these things, and at the end of the day, it baffles me the hold that power has on Christians and their willingness to trade the entire birthright that Jesus gave us for a bowl of soup. And I just, when I see that, that probably is the closest I ever get to saying, I just need to prune the roses and talk to the few that might come seeking wisdom, and just waiting for either my end or the Lord's return or whatever it is, because I just don't know how this gets done. And there's bright spots that break out every once in a while. But for me to spend my life waiting for the collapse of hypocrites, like that can't be a good way.
Are Christians
to live
supposed to
your
be
life.
frustrated? Because that sounds like an inevitable, frustrating life.
I think there is frustration, like in the lament sense.
Well, anyone who's awakened to what's really going on, or, the hardships of the world, or the nuances, or that.
Did you say woke?
Not sort of. No, but when you're awakened to the real issue and all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's not as simple as I thought it was. And there's this weird history. That is a frustrating life. It's not easy for anyone. To gain wisdom in life is not easy. It's putting the work in. So yes, being learned and awakened and curious and thoughtful and seeking wisdom is not an easy thing. It is a frustrating thing. And you have to learn how to carry that while still maintaining hope and loving others. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to say you're doomed to a life of frustration, because enlightenment, I think, is always a good thing. But
yeah, and look, I put my hope in the church and in the body of Christ. But I'm also enough of a realist to know that that doesn't have to always happen in the United States. When we talk about
so good.
When we
That's
talk
really
about
good.
when we talk about God bless America, I want to say, could we bless Canada? Could we bless Mexico?
Canada.
Could we bless the rest of Central America and then South
oh
America?
my God,
Would-
we totally
you're
had
genius.
this whole hour discussion with this slant and this bias I wasn't even aware of. And I'm like,
Yeah.
we really don't carry Christianity for the world.
But that's so maybe Christianity over time is going to erode further, and maybe just assume for a moment that it is because of this unholy alliance that has traded all of the standards of Jesus for political power and influence, and to gain and hold on to an American culture and a certain view of America, right? And say that causes further erosion, and Christianity just eventually melts away, especially with younger generations.
Yeah.
And that's what all the demographers are saying. As you see the younger generations coming, there is going to be some real change, but it might not be positive because it'll be a strong reaction. But what if it grows in other places?
That's so
and
true.
what if that is so? My hope isn't just in the American church. My hope is in like God's plan all over the world.
Yeah,
And when I
so
hear
right.
when I hear this growing in Iran, like in leaps and bounds, like, could you as a Republican say, God bless Iran?
Yeah.
Can you say that, and love? And even if you think they're our enemy, we're supposed to love our enemy, right? But there's a church movement that's growing there and they don't even know what to do with it because it keeps multiplying, right?
Yeah.
In the most unlikely place. Right? In a country that was a sworn enemy of the United States, right? The church is growing, right? And you think, God bless Iran. God bless the Christians there. May they multiply. May that whole nation be transformed. Why does it always have to be America? We had our time and maybe we'll continue by God's grace. And I would love it to be so because I live here and I love this country. I want it to stay that way. But if it's not, right, then it'll continue somewhere else because God is not going to be frustrated. So that's where I think the hope is. But I will say,
That's so good.
it
John.
is okay, though, wisdom to lament in that prophetic way, to just have a time of mourning and lament and to cry over what you see, not to just stand and wag your finger and just yell at people, but to actually just say, God, I'm just so like sorrowful over what I see. And don't make me arrogant in thinking that I'm the only one that sees it.
Yeah.
I mean, because I want to see it in myself too, because other people could see where I need to repent, but I just see this and it's gone on for so long. And, when my friend said, I'm a one-issue voter, it's abortion, it's the only issue. My response was, I'm kind of a one-issue voter. And my issue is young adults. And when millions and millions of them are going to walk away from the only source of life to come, when they walk away from what's meant to be given to them because of this issue, I wonder where more lives are lost, to abortion or to the fact that these people have walked away never to return because of the way we demonstrated our desire to do what might have been a really good thing, but the lengths we went to do it and the witness that we compromised and the way that we just stood into the world and showed ourselves, I think that may be the one issue.
Yeah.
So we have more to talk about. There is going to definitely be a part 2 to this conversation where we go into the subject of how so many people have become aligned with Christian nationalism. And we'll be asking the question, would Jesus make America great again? And we'll be back with that at another time. Tell us what you think. This is Jesus versus America.
Follow us on all social media platforms at Jesus versus America. And find more resources on our official website, jesusversusamerica.com.